Well, I think it's about time that we had a little chat about the T.16000M FCS HOTAS. I picked up this T160 a few weeks back after waiting a long time through all the back orders on Amazon, and I've had the chance to play with it through a small assortment of games to put this new HOTAS system through the paces and see whether or not it can stand up against other HOTAS systems out there. As most of you know, I am currently using the flagship of HOTAS systems, that being the Thrustmaster Warthog HOTAS. And although this HOTAS system is nowhere near the same price point at $130, I will be referencing a few things back and forth between the two systems for a few reasons that will become clearer later on. So let's first dive in to check out the basic features you get with a T160, starting out with the joystick itself. The stick is based on an older version that Thrustmaster made a few years ago, and although that look hasn't been upgraded, its sensors certainly have. The joystick is sporting the Hall effect accurate technology for a 16-bit resolution, which coincidentally is the same accuracy that is presented in the Thrustmaster Warthog HOTAS. The second major feature that is not predominantly present in most sticks is that it is ambidextrous. The system comes with parts that allow you to flip the grip feature for the left-handed freaks of our community. On the stick itself, we have 3 large buttons that are easily accessible, along with one central 4-way hat. The single-stage trigger has a nice large surface area that curves outward, which allows the user to put his index finger underneath the trigger as a makeshift safety if you do not desire to rest it on the trigger itself. For rudder control, if you do not have rudders, the stick does twist for the yaw action, so you're covered there. The base of the stick features 12 buttons and a slider that used to be used as a throttle in the old stick, but since this HOTAS does come with a throttle, the slider can now be used as an additional axis for whatever you may want. Moving on to the throttle, which is the main focus of this system, we have a nice few toys to play around with. The first thing to take note of is the way the throttle moves, as Thrustmaster designed this to move on a feature called Smart. In other words, instead of the throttle pivoting around a single axis like most throttles, it instead slides on rails back and forth, which does give it a much more sleek feel and definitely a lower profile. On the side of the throttle, we have a single orange push button and 2 4-way hats. The hat on the top here, however, is not a 4-way hat, but actually a 8-way POV, which is something that many reviewers have either failed to mention or never bother reading the manual about. Now, the front of the throttle is actually something to be happy about. I always personally fear this section as it includes a fairly sensitive piece that is crucial for precise control of your system. That would be the slew sensor. I am pleased to say that this is a very nice slew sensor, with a push button action included. So it very closely resembles console gaming pad joysticks in the way that it moves and feels, so you know it's going to be precise and well built. Next to the slew sensor, we have an up and down rocker type button, but it should be noted that this is not a slider, so not an axis, but instead a button with an up and down action. Next to that, we have 2 more orange push buttons, and next to that, we have a pinky axis rotary, which is a very nice thing to have, as it gives you the option to map that to a radar elevation scan in certain sims. Lastly, we have this very large flappy paddle type switch. I was very curious about the functionality of this paddle, and what nobody seemed to mention is that this is actually not a switch nor a button. It's an axis. I went ahead and played around with mapping this to a few different things, and indeed it does work as an axis. However, if you do not want to use it as an axis, and instead a push button type, you can map it as a button just as well. It's a very nice feature that actually had me grinning for a little while when I had discovered it. Okay, so now it's time to talk about the ergonomics of the system. Now, this category alone can make or break a joystick. As some of you are familiar with my slightly heated review of the X55, that thing was a disaster based only on ergonomics. I hated it. So, how well does this T160 system fare? Well, the joystick itself is very comfortable. It has a nice soft rubberized feature around the grip, and your whole hand sits in a relaxed position with access to all of the buttons without any strain or worrying about bumping into anything along the way. After hours of playtime, I was not strained by this joystick as the spring system in it is pretty much right where it needs to be. Now, on the throttle side, you can say the same thing. As it's a much smaller throttle, you can reach all of the buttons and knobs without issue, and again, you're not bumping into anything along the way. The buttons don't feel flimsy or wobbly, and the slew sensor is just a joy to move around. I will say that the 8-way POV is a bit tricky to use at first if you are aiming at hitting just one of those corners instead of the forward, back, up, and down sections. I found this POV to be most useful if you're looking to mapping it as a look-around feature in the pit, especially if you do not have track AR and you don't want to use the hat on the joystick to look around. In the back of the throttle, we have a port available for the Thrustmaster TFRP flight pedals via a RJ12 connector, which aims at reducing the need for another USB connection to your PC. Lastly, it should be noted that there is no visible way to adjust the friction on this, but there is indeed a way. First, you need to slide the throttle to the full up position and flip the throttle over, where you will notice a screw that you can tighten or loosen to adjust the friction. While we are here, we can also see two mounting screws, which you can use if you are building a home cockpit. The same can be observed on the back of the joystick. If you indeed are building a home pit, head on over to the Thrustmaster site and download their FCS cockpit setup PDF files for both the throttle and the joystick, which will give you the precise measurements of the mounting screws. So I went ahead and plugged this bad boy into Arma 3 first and flew in the choppers for a bit. This footage you can see here is the very first flight with this joystick, and I have to say that I was very impressed by the accuracy of this thing. It was so easy to use that it made my first flight look like I do this all the time. In reality, however, I've stopped flying helos in Arma a long time ago. So personally, I figured that I would be terrible at it, but as you can see here, I managed to fly like it's second nature to me. The last time I tried this was with the X52 series, and I was too busy going into the controls and trying to set up a curvature for the stick, just for it to feel right. Now in this T160, I didn't feel I needed to do that at all. There are no curves here. This is just a basic default setting, so I was fairly impressed by that alone. Next, I went and took it up a notch to Elite Dangerous. Since this system is basically partnered up with Elite, it was no surprise that there were no issues with this game and the HOTAS. I was able to map pretty much everything I wanted to, with some minor things omitted here and there. Overall though, the performance here was great and nothing really stood out to me as a negative. So with a game like this, the HOTAS basically felt right at home. Finally, I launched DCS World and decided on the A-10C module as my testbed, as this plane is pretty much one of the more demanding modules that we face in terms of trying to map the sheer number of buttons that are required to effectively operate this thing. To be perfectly honest, I felt like this HOTAS would suffer greatly here due to the lack of buttons on the joystick. The throttle would be more than fine, as it had enough hats and buttons to be able to map most of the important features, and it certainly did just that. I was able to use some of the hats on the throttle that don't exist on the Warthog HOTAS, as there we have 2- or 3-way buttons instead. So this helped in being able to map some extra buttons that would otherwise be found on the joystick. You could go even further by adding modifier keys that will essentially multiply the buttons available, which would of course cover pretty much every button that you can find on the joystick and throttle of the Warthog HOTAS. But I felt that I wanted to try and map as much as possible without using the target software or any modifier keys, and I was fairly surprised when I managed to map just about a good 90% of what I needed, with the throttle helping to mitigate the lack of hats on the joystick. The performance is obviously on point, as it's the same sensor as the Thrustmaster Warthog HOTAS, and it was really no issue to use this system in the A-10C module. Most notably, you will enjoy having the slew sensor being a proper sensor, unlike the one we find in the Warthog HOTAS. That certainly was a whole lot more fun to slew around. Therefore, I wouldn't at all discard this system as a competitor to other HOTAS systems for a game like DCS World and its modules. To summarize all my points, I can easily say that this mid-ranged HOTAS system is fantastic. However, it is not without its flaws. The biggest downfall this system has is certainly the joystick that is lacking hat keys. Although I was personally able to use the throttle's numerous hat switches to fill the joystick's hat key void, others may not be so convinced. Thus, this single point may be off-putting for a lot of viewers. If Thrustmaster had added 2 or hell, even 1 more additional hat switch on the joystick, I would say that this HOTAS system would be the absolute best choice for simmers who are looking for their first joysticks on a mild budget. Personally, I still think that this is an awesome HOTAS system, and I would recommend it regardless of the joystick's lack of hats. Also, don't forget that you can buy just the throttle on its own for $80, So if you wanted to pair it up with a more expensive joystick, say a Black Mamba, then you would have an awesome system on your hands. Additionally, there are some space simmers among us that want to have 2 joysticks plus a throttle, so if you are one of those, then there might not be much of an issue in mix and matching some hardware together just like this. Whatever choice you make, I can honestly say that you will not be disappointed by this T160. For this amount of cash, you do get a rather well-rounded system that is fun, accurate, and easy to use. But before I go, let me leave you with this. I chose to play with this system for several weeks to try and get the best possible impressions of the T160 and look for any flaws it may offer over this time, instead of just making a quick unboxing video and first impressions. The reason being is that we will often either overlook or never have the time to find any of the bugs or bad features that may arise over time. So it is your responsibility to do your own research and see whether or not new issues have crept up since the time of this video's posting. But to the best of my abilities, as of this time, there are no major failures that I am aware of. Well, that is it for me, ladies and gentlemen. I do hope that you got some good info out of this, and if you would like to keep up to date with my current projects, or just know what I'm up to, go ahead and visit my Twitter or Facebook page that will be linked in the description below, as it is the best way to get in touch with me and offer suggestions or just ask some questions. And with that, sayonara and good night.